Hey, so thanks for the introduction, thanks for the invite, and thanks for organizing this. This is pretty awesome. So it's my first Serverlessconf, the last one our CEO did. This is pretty amazing to have so many people who are so passionate about this new way to build infrastructure, and so many users and so much feedback as well. Really cool. And obviously keep it coming here or online anytime. I'm here today to talk to you guys a little bit more about getting the most out of the serverless framework specifically. So it's couple of different topics that I think is really important, not just to get started, to tell you where we're going next, how you can learn more about it, or even contribute in the future to it. So a wide array of topics, and then like a longer QA phase. So if you have any questions, happy to answer them here, happy to answer them later on outside as well. So I'm the CTO at Serverless. I'm responsible for the engineering team, but also specifically like for the framework. So I set the product direction and the next things that we built. So if you want something in serverless, open an issue or come up to me. And there's also Philip, who's over here. He's working as a core team on the framework itself as part of that core team. So he has a lot of knowledge on many different things of the serverless framework specifically as well, because he built them for the most part. So what I'm going to talk about today is a couple different topics. First of all, because there are some people here who are not yet familiar with serverless, who haven't used it, I really want to give a very quick introduction to what we're trying to achieve with serverless. Not necessarily like what different commands are, but what is our goal with the serverless framework? Why did we start it? And what do we want to build in the future to make it work for your Lambda or any functions as a service-based infrastructure? A couple of tips and tricks, or basically ways to get started with serverless, and things that I've seen people that just get started with it the stumble, but or that can really help them to get where they need to be. Our plans for the future, specifically for the next 3 to 6 months, it's very hard to say what happens after that because so much stuff is happening and so many new providers are coming in and so much new technology comes in. But I want to talk to you guys and get you excited about the next things that we're building, and obviously want to get your feedback and want to get you guys included in that. And then contribution. I think one of the big things is obviously the framework lives with its contributors, and it's so great to see so many of them here, and Nick and many others among them. But I think one of the misunderstandings in I think any open source framework, but I've seen that in serverless as well, is that contribution means code, and it really doesn't only. There's many ways to contribute, and many ways that really helps us. And I want to very quickly talk about the different ways, and hope to convince you guys to do some of them and help us out, and also learn more about the framework with that, and then jump into QA. So with that in mind, I want to just one quick question. Experience with the serverless framework. Could you just raise your hand if all you've done so far is heard of the framework before, but haven't used it? So that's, I guess, a third to half. So you haven't used it before. I built a small test of it. So it's just to get started with it, but haven't built anything beyond that. That's 15%, maybe 10, 15%. I'm building a service to put into production in soonish. About 10%, I guess. And you have something in production with the serverless framework. Also around 10%, I guess. Cool. So with that, an introduction to serverless is actually very appropriate. So the idea behind the serverless framework and the guiding motto that we have is technology and services for the serverless team. Obviously, and there's online many discussions about that, that they're still servers. Obviously, under the hood, somewhere, they're still servers. But you as a team don't have to care about them. Serverless, in our sense and how we see it, applies to the team. You don't care about servers, you don't manage servers, you don't think about servers. It's a concept that you don't have to deal with anymore. And that's the point why we think serverless for our framework, but also for the community, or for the way building this kind of infrastructure, is I think an appropriate term, even though there are servers, and we know that there are servers, which we sometimes hear. If you don't know that there's still servers in the background, we do. But it's about the serverless team. And it's really about like this kind of event-driven microservice infrastructure that we want to build. So you build these microservices, they automatically react to different events that are happening in your system. So in this case, we have a couple different services with different functions, and that's where really the framework comes in, where like Lambda or the other providers that are coming out now as well. It's more about the infrastructure of running the function itself, but it doesn't really have a way to describe an application, a way to describe different services, how they are set up, how they communicate with each other. And that's where the framework comes in. That's where we move, especially over the next couple of months, from like an infrastructure management tool where like we help you deploy your Lambda functions to more of an application framework. Like here's how you set up your services, here's how they communicate with each other, some best practices and some like built-in ways and best practices that we think and that we've seen that work really well for users. And obviously that's all driven through an event system that you don't control or think about. I think that's the main difference. Obviously we've done microservices and like background processing and event-driven systems for a long time. Like there is Kafka, and Kafka is great, but you have to manage Kafka, which is a lot of work. And the nice thing with like this kind of serverless approach and functions as a service approach is you don't control that event stream anymore. It just happens magically, and other people do that for you. And I think that's the main difference, and that's the real upside of this whole infrastructure, of this whole movement, that I think is really helpful, because you can focus on your business code. You focus on nothing else than what you make better than your competition. And it's typically not like scaling your service. Like a lot of people can do that. You should focus on your product. And that's what we're trying to help you guys with. And that event-driven infrastructure, for example, like events, like an HTTP event, like that gets turned into an API gateway with the appropriate methods and resources set, automatically deployed. Or S3, like we create the bucket for you, we create the bucket notifications for you, we set up the IAM permissions for you. But that's all stuff that like you shouldn't have to think about all day. Like it should just be there. And that's what the framework is all about. Because otherwise that onboarding experience in this, like in the serverless world, is still like hard. If you have to build all your Lambda functions yourself, do that kind of stuff. And we turn this kind of configuration into CloudFormation. And the nice thing there is that with CloudFormation, you have full control to do whatever you want. You can extend your template. I'll show you that in a second, how that's possible. But you have full control over your infrastructure, but a much simpler way to get started, get it set up, and build it. So really our guiding principle there as well is like we want to make the 80% of the use cases that is the same across like all teams easy, and the 20% possible. Like there's many use cases where it's super specific to your team and your company, and we will never be able to fully capture that in like a very simple YAML syntax because it's very specific to what you do. But you should be able to do this, and there's various ways that we can do this for you. One of them, and that is a little bit hard for beginners to the framework to get in the beginning. And so we did a workshop 2 days ago, and I could really see like as soon as people got the concept of like how we merge infrastructure and merge resources together, like they fully understood like how much power that is basically. Because in the end, like on the left side, you can see like a function configuration. Like it's a YAML syntax. We turn that into CloudFormation syntax. And then in that same YAML file, you can also define your own CloudFormation syntax, and we merge them together in the end. So we merge it like the one in the middle on top of what we create on the left side, which means any resources that we create for you, you can extend. You can add something to it. In this case, for example, we have an S3 bucket. We want to be able to upload files into that S3 bucket directly, so we need core settings. That's what we did in the workshop. And for that to work, we need to extend it. We don't want to bloat our configuration. Like we don't want to make every single configuration of CloudFormation available in your YAML file, because that's very complex. There's a lot of stuff to think about, and that is a use case that not everybody has. So that falls more into those 20%. You can have a debate if cores should be supported in there as well, and it might be in the future. But yeah, that's very easy to extend and to get to your full CloudFormation template. Like that. So that's, you can extend your infrastructure, use anything you like. So you never, ever should run into the problem that serverless isn't supporting it, so I can't do it. Like something is available in CloudFormation or in AWS, but serverless isn't supporting it, so I can't do it. That is a pain that we never, ever want anybody to run into. And that's one of the areas where we can help there. And the other one is all of serverless itself is a plugin system. Like we built the core, and even all of our AWS integration is plugins, and they have no special rights or anything specifically. Like all the other provider integrations that we're currently working on are plugins, and you can build your own plugins. And we were even like one of the things so far, like up until like early next week, once I'm back from the conference and I merged the pull request finally, building a plugin was kind of a little bit more cumbersome because you had to do a little bit more steps. it'll be easier from tomorrow on specifically to build plugins that are only used for one service. Like you want in this one service to have something where you can dynamically change the CloudFormation template. Or maybe you want to introduce another resource that isn't in CloudFormation yet, so you want to go through the AWS API or something like that. And what you will be able to do is simply you have a .serverless-plugins folder in your service. You drop a Node.js file in there. It listens to a lifecycle event. So if you read through the plugin docs, it's pretty simple, but every command like deploy has a bunch of different lifecycle events that you can hook into and then run your code. And so with a few lines of Node.js, you will be able to like change the configuration and do whatever you like. So this is really, really powerful. And we have seen many people, and there's also like a talk later today by Anna about like plugins in general and serverless plugins in general. It's a very, very powerful way to extend your system and to get those 20% of use cases that are very specific to what you want to do, make that impossible. So we really, really, really want to make sure that you're never blocked by us not supporting anything or by like AWS and CloudFormation not supporting anything. You'll always be able to go on and build whatever you need to build. So with that, a few tips. I mean, they're relatively basic, but just to get started, because I've seen a couple of people stumble on that from time to time, or they might not have invested the time in that. We work really, really hard on our docs. Like our docs is something that we iterate almost as often as our as serverless itself. So like really, really go into the docs and read through the guide, work through the guide. Like there is a really good guide that shows you like all the most important things to get started. And generally the docs aren't very long. We are, as every contributor can tell you, we're very pushy on adding documentation to every pull request. If the documentation isn't up to date, and Nick is yes, yeah, we're not accepting any pull request if the documentation isn't up to date. And we're very, very thorough on that documentation as well. So just to make sure that everything is really up to date. Because for us, like technology is one part, but if the technology is good, but the whole onboarding experience and documentation experience isn't good, then you guys are just not going to use the system, or you're going to have a harder time, especially in medium and larger size companies. If you want to roll out a technology to 20, 50, 100 engineers, you need good docs, examples, workshops, all that kind of stuff. And so we're going to provide more and more of that going forward. So really, really look through the documentation, read through it, read through the different events that are available, the different options that are in there. We see like regularly people building like using custom resources to merge some configuration in. That is an option that is available already or might become available at some point. So definitely check that out. And there is, on the bottom right, there is an edit on GitHub button. That is, I think, a very good idea from one of our engineers who put that in. If you find a typo, send us a pull request. We really appreciate it. Every typo, just send in a pull request, we merge them in quickly and redeploy the site. That really helps to keep the documentation up to date and make sure that everything is in there and there's no typos and anything else that needs to be in there. There's a lot of different commands, or a couple of different commands, and we add more and more and more all the time, that really help you to debug and build your system. So from something that I've seen people rarely know about is like serverless deploy function or the logs command, which are so helpful for you to understand. Like, I never want you to need to go into the AWS console to read logs. Like that just doesn't make a lot of sense because it's kind of cumbersome to use. So that's why we introduced this one. Or like if you want to not go through the whole CloudFormation deployment, but only deploy like a single function, quickly deploy new code and get that out the door. You can do that with the serverless deploy function code. If you have other ideas for things that you need in your local developer experience that need to be faster, we're working on offline, for example, that you can run your functions offline right now and other stuff. And we're adding more and more functions constantly. So make sure to regularly check the CLI reference. And while this sounds very, very basic, it's something that I've seen a lot of teams or a lot of people like not be as productive as they could be because they didn't know all the different commands we provide and we're adding over time. So that definitely makes sense to really, really look into. And we're moving pretty fast at this point. So we have a bi-weekly release cycle. So every 2 weeks, another release happens. We're very diligent with the changelog to make sure that we show you like all the stuff that happened, all the changes that are coming in, especially the highlights so you know like what's coming. One feature that is coming out soon, like a developer's been working on this week, is that you can pin a version on a service so that you can say this service can only be deployed with version X of serverless, so that you don't accidentally go in and redeploy with another version and then you kill your whole infrastructure or like resources are additionally created or removed that you don't want them to be. It'll support Semver, so you can be reasonable about like different versions. One thing we're now switching, like after version 1, we're now switching to strict Semver. So don't be surprised if you see 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, 5.0. That's if you do a very small breaking change, we'll increase the major version. Like we want to be very, very, very strict about this going forward. So don't be surprised if we increase the major version a lot. It's not, we might increase the major version every couple of weeks going forward, and it's not a bad thing. It's just that we want to be very strict and that you don't run into any kind of surprises in your deployment. We've made a lot of steps forward to make sure in terms of stability that nothing happens, massively increased our test suite, our integration test suite. Our integration test suite is also a good place to check out to get a better understanding of how specific functionality works. They're well structured, so you can see like different things in some testing area, how to do some kind of testing as well with it. That really helps in that regard. So yeah, definitely check out the changelog regularly. Every 2 weeks we do, so first of the month, or like Tuesday, Wednesday in the first week of the month, and Tuesday or Wednesday in like mid of the month we release. So it's typically like first, second, third, and 14, 15, 16 is typically what we come down to. We release a new version, and for us this is a good forcing function to like regularly get new stuff out so that new features don't get stuck in like pull request hell or like in on master, but they never go out for forever, and so that you guys don't have to install like from master and all kind of stuff. So yeah, definitely check that out and make sure you're up to date on these things, but also pin your version as soon as that feature is out there. So that was a very brief introduction of a couple of things. With that, I want to very quickly like go over what we think is the future of serverless and where we think serverless framework really has to go. Obviously, like so we started with the framework about a year and a half, or our CEO started with the framework about a year and a half ago. I joined in April as the CTO. And we raised some money recently, so we're also we're really investing heavily in the framework. We want to make sure that that framework is available and can be used for anyone from like really small companies to really large companies. That includes functionality, but it includes a lot of content, blog post, documentation as well that we're going to invest into heavily. But yeah, really like our goal with the framework is we want you to go from like 2 services and like 5 functions that you deploy to like 50, 60, 100 services with hundreds and hundreds of functions that you deploy. And there's a couple of different things that we have to tackle over the next couple of months to make that possible, and a couple of things that are currently, in our opinion, stopping you from doing that. And so those are mainly, first of all, service composition. Once I go from like a few services to many, many services, it's not just about technology and features, but like how to do that. What are the best practices? So there's going to be a couple of features for that, but it's mostly about documentation, examples, workshops, videos, best practices to help you to understand how can I build my microservice infrastructure best on Lambda, best on, in the future, Google, Azure, IBM OpenWhisk, really making sure that you know how to separate your services, how you build them up, how they can communicate with each other. The second one, that's a big one, and especially like Ben yesterday mentioned that, is service discovery. This is a huge one because it's not just about having 50 services and how do they connect to each other so you don't hard code it. It gets more complex once you think about different stages. So for example, you have 50 services. You deploy them to a dev stage, a QA stage, and a production stage. That's already pretty complex, and you want to make sure that they just find each other and connect to each other all across those stages. But it gets more complex because as a developer, like I work on the user service. So what I want to do for testing purposes, like local development testing purposes, I want to deploy my dev, like this one service that I'm working on, and I want it to work together with all the other services. I don't want to deploy 50 different services. Like I want to deploy this one thing, and then it should talk to the other services that are not in my immediate development state, like in my user stage, but like in the dev stage, and like to communicate with those. Like how do we make this work that every developer, and then you have like 50 developers who all want to do that. That becomes pretty complex pretty quickly. And there's different ways that we're thinking about. So from environment variables, so we're pushing AWS very, very hard on environment variables, and please, all of you, do that too, because I think that's the most important, at least for me personally, it's the most important feature that we need on Lambda is environment variable support. And I know that they heard this many, many times, but they should hear it a couple more times. And the second one is, because then like during deployment, what we can do is twofold. During deployment, we know the layout of your infrastructure, or we can read your layout of your infrastructure during deployment. A lot of that stuff we can statically kind of compile into environment variables, and we can provide you with an SDK, and we will provide you with an SDK that reads those environment variables and can do some interesting stuff, like how to call other functions, stuff like that in terms of communication. But also things like if you add additional resources to your CloudFormation template, we can expose them to your through environment variables into your system. And that was one of the main reasons why we dropped environment variable support between 0.5 and 1.0, is that we moved to CloudFormation. So deployment is now one step. So without environment variable support in Lambda directly, we cannot set this anymore because it's just one step. In the past, it was like going through the APIs. We set up resources, we knew the endpoint, then we update some variable or some file and then deployed that. That doesn't happen anymore, that we can't do that anymore in this way. And so that's something that we hope is coming very, very soon. The other part of service discovery is DNS. From Route 53 API gateway endpoints that have proper DNS settings on like some custom domains and all that kind of stuff. So that it's not just service discovery for internally in your infrastructure, but also service discovery from the outside world. It's also like there's a lot of important things, like for example, API gateway at this point only being public. So every API gateway is automatically public, so you don't really want to go through every API gateway, like put an API gateway in front of every internal service, potentially, because then that is public. I hope and I'd assume that they are working on something that you can put it in a VPC or something, or like keep it private in some ways. Well, there's some ways to work around it. It's not that nice. That's some of the things, but yeah, service discovery, huge and important point. If you have many, many services, it gets really, really complex, really fast. So that's a big thing. And next one is service communication. I'll show you a few examples in just a second. But yeah, again, you have many, many services, and you want to talk between those services. You don't want to open up any communication path from any service to any service, because that means everybody can talk to everything in your infrastructure. That's kind of insecure. So you want to have controls over like when to open up which path, and then have an SDK and tooling that just does that automatically for you. So you want to send out some custom business event. You want to call another function. You want to be notified when a specific function in another service runs or fails. I'll show you an example in a second. And that should all be built in with serverless. Like we'll set up the infrastructure for you. We'll set up like an SNS topics, Kinesis streams, or whatever the specific like technology behind it will be. But you shouldn't really have to care about it. Like it's not really like, why should you care how exactly I call this other function? Like it should just be stable, it should work, and we want to take care of that. The next one is security controls. So by default, everything should be locked down. And IAM is, let's say, complex in the beginning, and the tooling is not the easiest. So we want to make sure that every infrastructure you deploy with serverless gets completely locked down from the beginning, and you can slowly increase like access wherever you need it to be. And there's a lot of like, you can do that already with serverless. It's just not as convenient as it should be. So you can lock everything down, just not as nice as it should be. And so that's a lot of things, especially like once you go to larger companies, it's not an optional thing. It's like when that isn't in place, then they just can't use the tool. But I think putting these best practices in place for small teams really helps them once you start scaling up your infrastructure and building those services, building those best practices into the tooling from the beginning. And the last one, multi-provider support. Obviously, as you can see out there, other providers think functions as a service, and serverless as a concept is really interesting. They're building a lot of stuff, pushing really hard. We're working with kind of all of them together at this point, and have either pull requests in stages or like and are working on it with them. So that's something that's coming. And multi-provider support, for me personally, like we're not planning to build like a serverless layer, so like every provider feels the same and there's like a serverless way. So you won't be able to say, I take this Lambda function and put it directly into Google or something. That's not really our goal, because the function itself, like changing a function handler to be able to run in Lambda and in Google, is pretty easy. And we're probably going to introduce like a wrapper that makes this like standardized. But it's not really, the big problem is not moving your function over. The big problem is the infrastructure. If you use DynamoDB, if you use S3, if you use many other Kinesis, many other services, you cannot just map that between providers. So our goal is we want to give you a standard way to configure your project, standard way like processes, commands to run it. So the syntax and the processes are the same across providers, but the semantics, what happens after my deployment, how exactly does it get deployed to, those are different per provider, so you can get the most power out of each and every provider. And that's what I think in our opinion, where the future of serverless infrastructure will be is that you have, and multi-provider support will be, is you have a couple of things running in AWS that make the most sense in AWS. And then if you want to do like language processing, you might have it in Google or maybe in IBM with Watson or whatever. Or maybe you want to have some parts. I talked to like one team here that does video transcoding. And so they need every bit of power that they can get out of the machine. And Lambda isn't flexible enough for that yet. So they might want to take OpenWhisk and run it on like a couple of EC2 instances where they have full control over it. It's still kind of the same process though then. And so that's the goal that we're going forward with multi-provider support. And we can definitely see that if all of the providers build really competitive products, which I assume they have or will, that people are going to use it this way. And so that's what we're preparing for. And to show you a quick example of what I meant before with service communication, so we have like over here on the left, you can see like we have these functions, like we have create user and then send a welcome email whenever that happens. And so whenever the create user function in that same service starts, type start. And that is just an example. That is not an implementation. We're not actually building that yet. That is just to give you a little bit of a picture. Then execute this function. And it's just another event. Like it keeps going down that event-driven path so that you think about your infrastructure in terms of events. Or here even like in another service, like you have the test service public function. And when it fails, then I want this function to run. And then we have this other function. We can set it to subscribable. Then it creates that infrastructure, it creates that listening infrastructure, and we can do that kind of stuff for you. So that's the kind of approach that we want to take, that you want this thing to happen, you want this thing to configure, but you don't want to take care of the infrastructure or build the infrastructure. It should just happen. But it all runs in your infrastructure. You can monitor it. We can automatically add alerts to it, all that kind of stuff, metrics. But you should have an easy time really doing that. And then that obviously can be coupled with service discovery across different stages, all that kind of stuff that you really need. And same for service communication. Like, let's say you have a couple of different, that's what I want to show. So let's say you want to have like one service that should call another service. By default, it's locked down. You can't call it. So you just say, hey, I'm calling this other service and other function. The neat thing is like, what, for example, if you say calling some function and you have only one sum function defined, then you don't even in the SDK invoke down there necessarily even have to give the service name, because we know which functions you have access to. And so if it matches only one of them, we don't need the service name because we can derive the service name automatically. Or maybe you just opened up like one other function. So you just do sdk.invoke and it just automatically knows which one to call. Like that's some ideas. Like we'll have more of them, and there's GitHub issues open to discuss all of that. I've released a blog post recently to talk about that, and there's GitHub issues. That's the way that we think about like how we want to work with you guys as a community to like open that up in GitHub issues. Like we kind of try to think about, okay, where do we want to go? Then we do longer descriptions in GitHub issues, and then we want you guys to help us jump in and like bring in your ideas, bring in your use cases, your needs to make sure that it really works the way you need it to. And obviously also hopefully contribute and help us with building it. But yeah, check out those issues and that blog post on our blog that talks a little bit more about like the direction that we're taking now. And so before jumping into the QA, I very quickly want to talk about contributing because oftentimes I feel, people feel that contributing is only code, and if you don't code, you don't contribute. And I think that's very, very wrong. I think contributing can be many, many different things. We have great people who spend a lot of time, like contributors who spend a lot of time in the forum, which means that I don't have to worry as much if people in the forum get a lot of attention, enough support, if everything works fine. And that means that I can spend more time on product. I can spend more time talking to users. So it frees our time up to do other things. And there's opening bugs or issues, letting us know and in detail describing the bug. So we have a relatively complex issue template and pull request template. The reason is, if you give us more information, we don't have to go back and forth all the time. And the more information you give us, the easier for us it is, or for somebody else to pick up that and implement it. So spending a little bit more time on that, or like really looking into a bug in terms of like, okay, how does that happen? How is it reproducible? That really, really helps. Pull request reviews. If you get in a new pull request and somebody jumps on it, and we have that a couple of times, and just test it out and finds like things that don't work with that pull request, that means we don't have to find those bugs in this new pull request. Somebody else did. We can spend more time on other things. And that's really, really helpful. Obviously, like we have our help wanted and help wanted easy label issues. And I think you were Anna yesterday that the help wanted easy, like people jump on that so quickly that like most of them are already taken. So we're trying to fill that up. But yeah, if you find like small things and like rough edges at serverless that you think could be done better, and that could be like a log message that isn't the right way or something. Like I think in a lot of projects, like people write immediately like, please submit a pull request. Like if you like submit an issue with like, here's how it is and here's how I would like it to be, that's awesome, because that means somebody else can potentially pick it up in Help on it easy, and we can work on it and make those rough edges go away. So don't feel bad about like submitting small, because I have the same feeling in other projects. Like when I have a small issue, instead of like, I don't have the time to do a pull request, or I don't understand the code or project enough, but I want this to happen, but I feel uncomfortable doing a very small issue because like I could do that myself. So that's don't worry about this. Just put everything in, every idea that you have, every small edge that could be better, put it in. If you jump on it, awesome. If somebody else can jump on it and you give more people the chance to jump on stuff and make serverless better, also awesome. So please don't feel bad about like submitting small issues, small rough edges. They're really, really helpful. And yeah, and a lot of like jumping on bugs or anything like that, submitting bugs, helping to review bugs, helping to review code, share your thoughts on issues. So that's all really helpful, because that allows us to spend less time on these things and more time on building product, which really, and serverless specifically, which really helps. And yeah, check out the contribution guidelines. They are very up to date and very detailed about like how to contribute to serverless and help out with that. And yeah, in general, to keep up to date. So we're currently also working on our commercial product. So we raised some money and we're working on commercial products. You can keep up to date on that if you just go to serverless.com and kind of sign up for the newsletter or sign up with it. Documentation, I spend a lot of time now on our milestones. So I have a very detailed planning of like what the next milestones will be, so you know what's coming. And yeah, and check out those labels. You can also see like what people are working on, what can be done, other issues that are coming up. And we're also now starting with serverless events. So next week there will be office hours, so an online event, and we'll do more and more of that, because obviously we have people from everywhere here, and we'll help you with like local meetups as well. So if you ever plan to do a local meetup in your city, let us know, contact us, and we'll help you set it up, sponsor it, or like whatever we can do, send some swag there, whatever we can do. But yeah, we'll also do more online meetups. So office hours starts next week. And I also want to start a contributor online meetup, like a monthly meetup where like some of the core contributors come together, like everybody can join, and then mostly the core contributors will discuss specific like implementation issues or like directions, talk a little bit about stuff that's coming up, or even, and you can ask questions from the core contributor community. And so not just from serverless or the people at serverless, but people like Nick, for example, who works in it, Sanda, and many other people that are in the room or working on it from home. So that really helps. Yeah, so with that, I want to jump into questions. We have a few more minutes for questions. Any specific questions that I can help with?